thing about RoboCop is, it keeps getting better every year. It was already good when it came out, and now we're all living in the future it depicted, whether we want to admit it or not. People used to call me cynical when I'd say things like that, but they don't do that so much anymore, and I take that as a really bad sign. Real monkey's paw future I'm living in over here. Cynicism usually gets a bad rap, despite being popularized by one of the realest real G's in ancient Greece, Diogenes the dog. He didn't create cynicism, but he did carry the torch down through the years, mostly by living a life full of stories that are too good not to repeat, even if they aren't all true. The big one is, of course, that time he owned Alexander the Great so hard and so publicly that not only did he get away with it, he may have saved an entire city from destruction. Hashtag life goals. But my personal favorite is that time he owned Plato by showing up to one of Plato's lectures and just straight up taking a shit on the floor. Ironically enough, proving that Platonic ideals do exist, because that right there is the Platonic ideal of a negative review. Especially on the internet. Like modern cynics, Diogenes considered most people, normal people, to be pretty shit. But unlike modern cynics, he did not chalk this up to some abstract, unchangeable, intangible bullshit like human nature. For him, the general shittiness of humanity was a product of the arbitrary, capricious, and entirely artificial prison we had all managed to trap ourselves in, usually known as civilization. We are not naturally shitty. We have to be taught to be this shitty through a lifetime of what we now call operant conditioning. Since the United States of America is a nation founded by Roman Republic fanboys, who were themselves in turn classical Greek fanboys, our society still conditions its citizens to adore fame, fortune, and power over others pretty much for their own sakes. And because it is lifelong, this conditioning is incredibly effective. Most people don't even notice, and when you point it out to them, they shrug and go, "Oh, what can you do?" Indeed. Speaking of stories that are too good not to repeat, according to modern movie legend, writer Edward Neumeier walked past a poster of Blade Runner in 1982 and asked a friend, "Hey, what's this new Harrison Ford movie about?" His friend gave the technically incorrect, but fairly standard answer that, oh, it's about a cop who chases down robots. And in a grand moment of writerly inspiration, Neumeier allegedly thought, wait, what if the robot was a cop? Really, Neumeier was working on a robot cop script while Blade Runner was still getting butchered in the editing room. It took Neumeier until 1984 to hook up with music video director Michael Miner, who was working on a similar idea called Super Cop. With their powers combined, they started to get their script looked at by the movers and shakers of mid-80s Hollywood. Not the top players, of course, but at least a few mid-level dudes, most of whom laughed their idea out of the office. 1984 was also the year Dutch filmmaker Paul Verhoeven moved to Hollywood to seek his fortune and make the Rutger Hauer sword and pillage movie Flesh and Blood, which flopped. Shrugging that off, Verhoeven turned to the spec script pile every director used to have, before franchise pictures started coming out on an assembly line. There he found Neumeier and Miner's RoboCop, and promptly tossed it into the trash, where a lot of people thought it belonged just based on the title alone. We might not even have a RoboCop at all, and Verhoeven's American career would have gone very differently had his wife Martine not fished the script out of the trash, actually read it, and said, hey, wait a minute, you may have something here. This is nearly identical to a story Stephen King tells about the first 3 or so chapters of Carrie. And it underlines a piece of advice I first heard from Old Man Saul in Darren Aronofsky's Pi. Listen to your wife. She will give you perspective. Making this movie was, by all accounts, a miserable disaster from start to finish. as if having a protagonist named Murphy called the full force of Murphy's Law down on this production's head. This makes the finished product even more remarkable for its coherence and overall quality. It's a slick 100 minutes that never wastes a second, creating a world so well realized that it can now easily pass for a documentary, despite being just as much of a cyberpunk dystopia as anything else inspired by Blade Runner, directly or otherwise. Neumeier envisioned all this taking place in something very much like Ridley Scott's 2019 LA. But Verhoeven wisely, and budget-consciously, chose to set it in a not-too-distant future, nearly indistinguishable from the then-present, except for some signage and some obvious robotics technology. Like the best cyberpunk dystopias, RoboCop takes place in a world entirely captured by rapacious corporations, with one in particular standing above all the others as the true antagonist of this film, and indeed the entire franchise, whether the franchise's creative leads knew it or not. Omni Consumer Products, OCP. See, it almost spells cop, so it's no wonder they got the contract to fund and run the Detroit Police Department before this film opens up. It's even less of a wonder that they're deliberately running the department into the ground in a bid to eventually replace everyone with deliberately defective robots. Back in 1987, Ed 209 was an obvious to the point of being on the nose metaphor for automation, planned obsolescence, and the aesthetics of a product being more important than its function, at least to the product's manufacturers. That grille on the front, what purpose does that even serve? Well, none, but it looks cool. Just like the grills on your truck, right? Nowadays, I can see Ed 209 as a metaphor for all that, and what the American injustice system turns people into. Malfunctioning murder machines. A better metaphor than RoboCop himself, even. Omni Consumer Products comes from looking at early Reagan-era trends of corporate America and taking them to their logical conclusion. We're taught, propagandized really, that capitalism depends on competition, but since capitalist wealth is tied to unrestrained, ever-expanding growth, capitalists actually hate competition and seek to destroy it or buy it out at the earliest possible opportunity. Look no further than the history of YouTube itself to see what I mean. YouTube's current CEO used to be the head of Google Video back when that existed. Once upon a time, Google Video tried to compete with YouTube directly. But despite being explicitly tied to what was already becoming the aspirin or Band-Aid of internet search engines, a brand name that's now an eponym for an entire concept, Google it. Google Video never really caught on with most people. I personally never used it for anything more than finding old MST3K episodes that I couldn't find on DVD at the time. And now, of course, they're all on YouTube still. So in 2006, Google backed a truckload of money up the driveways of YouTube's founders, and the rest is increasingly depressing history. Mostly because the sale told every other entertainment company exactly what YouTube was worth. So, no surprise, a few years later, Paramount sued them for exactly as much money as Google paid for them in the first place. The settlement of which gave us the Content ID system and all that fun stuff my fellow creators have to deal with still today. And there's your competition. Capitalists consider governments to be competition as well, since governments can theoretically limit capital's unrestrained growth through things like taxation and regulation. And that's why, ever since at least the mid-1970s, both taxation and regulation have been labeled inherently evil by right-wing politicians around the world. This was, and is, a deliberate attempt to starve government of the money and power they need to restrain the effects of capitalism, or even ameliorate them in any meaningful way, like How's about some earned income tax credits, folks? As a result, we now live in a world full of OCPs. And the only things that seem to be stopping them from consolidating even further are the egos of the various old men at their heads. See, for example, the now legendary pissing contest between Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. The one thing I could maybe ding this movie for was its naive assumption that Capital would treat the police the same way they treated every other public sector union in the 80s. Most other public sector unions don't have the right to carry guns and summarily execute people in the street and get away with it. Nor can Capital rely on any other union for the protection of their oh-so-wonderful property. So much more valuable than pathetic human lives. It's a by now familiar playbook, especially if you come from a family of teachers, like some of us. Step 1. Make working conditions worse until everybody goes on strike. Step 2. Use the strike as an excuse to fire everyone. And, in Step 3, replace them all with either cheaper labor or machines made by cheaper labor. This happened to air traffic controllers in 1981, and by firing everyone who refused to go back to work, the devil Ronald Wilson Reagan told every union in the country that the executive branch of the U.S. federal government would no longer have their back. From there, it's easy to imagine a civic government handing its own enforcement arm over to a private corporation, especially if that corporation already seems to own everything. We practically are the military, Dick Jones, senior vice president of OCP, says at one point, and I believe him. But if that's true, it means they already have the feds by the short and curlies, and their desire to bulldoze old Detroit and replace it with Delta City is little more than a mopping up job. A consolidation of already assumed power. A great big victory lap around American democracy. Which, to be fair, even its founders were never really all that into. And that was before the French Revolution made them all shit their pantaloons and declare every mass movement they didn't like a mob. If you liked Hamilton, you'll love the Whiskey Rebellion. No, you won't, but I just want to see people's reactions. From what we see, OCP's power seems total. There's no mention of the federales here, and no member of local government appears on screen. They saved that for the sequel, but we'll talk about that later. Sergeant Reed, commander of the Metro West Precinct, is the highest-ranking civic authority figure we meet. And he spends the whole movie eating shit from OCP, where the closest thing we see to politics takes place. As with the absolute monarchies of old, politics mostly involves jockeying for the number 2 position, occupied at the start of the film by Dick Jones, played by the great Ronnie Cox, who probably got this role because he played a lieutenant in Beverly Hills Cop. Because this is also about a police officer from Detroit. And it's not a comedy, but sometimes pretty funny. Jones is an interesting mix of corporate heir apparent and old-fashioned warlord, working both sides of the legal line for the benefit of himself, which he sees as indistinguishable from the benefit of the company. Literally, damn the consequences, full speed ahead. Who cares if it worked or not, he says to his rival Bob Morton at one point. The very rival who capitalized on the Ed 209 not working. As far as Jones is concerned, Ed 209 did exactly what it was designed to do before the first part rolled off the assembly line. Bilk 25 years worth of money out of the Pentagon. And that's all. He views OCP's relationship to Detroit the same way. Detroit is a resource to be strip mined for all it's worth. A cash hose to be hooked up into the company. A person with a functioning moral compass might find some contradiction between running a city police department and keeping a notorious cop-killing crime boss on retainer. But if your goal is to turn a city into such a complete shithole that its increasingly shrinking tax base winds up paying you to bulldoze everything and start over, well, then the Jones-Bottger alliance makes perfect sense. At least for Jones. It's not just that the ends justify the means. It's that the means are themselves the ends. And appealing to anything other than that will get you either laughed at best, or murdered outright at worst. Not that Bob Morton, played by Miguel Ferreira in what was meant to be his breakout role, and kind of was for some of us, especially those of us who appreciate his voice actor work later in life, ripped to a true savage. It's not that Bob is some kind of sainted martyr. I've seen him compared to Victor Frankenstein, and while he does create what's arguably a new life form, and let that new life loose upon a world full of serious assholes, at least Victor started out with altruistic motives. Bob dies living out what was probably his fondest dream, a cocaine and models party. Because if there is an end to modern capitalism, other than making more money, it's to let preening narcissists like Bobby Boy over here live out their boring, normal, middle school rock star fantasies. And he's punished for it. Because under capitalist morality, pretending that isn't the most insulting oxymoron you've ever heard for a second, you're supposed to always be on what we now call that grind. You're not supposed to take time out to media break and chill with a couple of hotties. We never see Dick or Clarence doing that. Do they even have homes to go to? Dick could live in that office for all we know. It's big enough, just put a cot in the corner. And Clarence seems to spend all of his time running around, babysitting a gang of giggling idiots, and trying to secure his position against other drug dealers, with even bigger gangs of idiots. All for the promise, from Dick Jones of course, that at some point in the not-too-distant future, Clarence will get to control the criminal markets of Delta City. Dick just needs these one or two little things taken care of first. And that's how the whole sorry system works. Unless you're already rich, the best you can hope for is to be the retainer of some rich asshole. Sure, he might promise you a big payday, but that big payday is always gonna be just around the corner. There's always gonna be just one more little thing that needs doing. Anything to keep us all on the hamster wheel, for the sake of people who seem like they were born in three-piece suits and genuinely love sitting through 18 hours of tedious meetings every day. Lost in all of this, ground between the gears of it like Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, is Murphy, whom I haven't talked about yet because he tends to get all the press. Guess that's what happens when one of your names is also the title. But Murphy is the perfect capitalist subject. What our corporate overlords would like very much to turn all of us into. Not just physically, but psychologically. After he dies, he's reborn as a blank slate with nothing but programming to guide him. No longer a man, or even a cop, but a product. For all their bluster about projecting the end of crime within 40 days... very biblical number, that. Bob Morton and OCP spent untold millions of dollars, and we're not even sure how many months, like at least 3, maybe even 4, just to recreate slavery. What are they gonna do? Replace us? Yes, random cop in the firing range scene, and your only choice in a system that likes to say freedom of choice over and over again until it becomes an empty liturgy, will be between a replacement with a vaguely humanoid outline and maybe a sliver of face peeking out from under its helmet, or a tank with legs that can't even go downstairs. At least RoboCop screams when you stab him, though that could be more a factor of some kind of full-body phantom limb syndrome than anything mechanical. Or maybe I'm wrong. After Murphy has his first post-resurrection dream about his own murder, one of the lab coats in charge of babysitting him down in the holding cells, and there's an image that's pregnant with meaning all by itself, the future of law enforcement. It's right there on the poster, chilling in the basement of the bacon shack, probably right down the hall from the drunk tank. Says, this system was never designed for a somatic response. And that is interesting. The somatic nervous system is the one in charge of all those muscles you can consciously move, as opposed to the autonomic nervous system, which keeps your heart beating and food moving through your guts without you having to really think about it. But this is not to say that the somatic nervous system is always under our control, especially not when we're asleep. RoboCop tosses in his sleep, and considering the content of his dreams, can we really blame him? But this system was never designed for a somatic response means that he shouldn't even be capable of tossing in his sleep. From one perspective, the death and life of Alex Murphy is the story of the triumph of the human spirit escaping the technological prison it's trapped in, both physically and metaphorically. What is the perfect last line in this already nearly perfect movie? The old man asks RoboCop, "What's your name?" And he says Murphy, with a quiet confidence and the warmest smile he's given since he died and came back to life. Before he died, the Murphy family lived at 548 Primrose Lane. The primrose blooms in early spring, and therefore it represents new life and new beginnings. And RoboCop is beginning a new life here too, even as the ghosts of his old one drive him back to his old house. The ghosts give him a new purpose, a personal one, separate from his programming, but complementary to it. Like Murphy's prime directives, which complement without directly overriding each other, except Directive 4. They're usually compared to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, because after all, there are 3 of them. But unlike Asimov's laws, these 3 are, for the most part, empty cliches. Serve the public trust. Well, what the fuck does that even mean? Well, it means that democracy rests on the idea that the public, the masses, the population, whatever, is the real seat of government power and authority, theoretically wielding it by placing their trust in representatives, either by electing them or having someone they elected dole out power to other people. Even if that may have once been true, and you can have a real argument about that, given this country's long history of voter suppression, which continues to this day, it certainly isn't true now. The business of America is business, President Calvin Coolidge didn't actually say, but enough people think he did that he might as well have. They certainly act like he said it, and take it to mean that it's actually good massive corporate monopolies own and control everything. So, there's your public trust. The public trusts that its elected representatives are all crooks and liars, easily swayed by greed. Prove us wrong. Protect the innocent is a little more straightforward. Even if we accept the judgmental Protestant worldview so central to American psychology that nobody's actually innocent, since we're all sinners in the hands of an angry God, some people are more innocent than others. Though this movie does stack the deck in Murphy's favor by putting him in situations where it's pretty easy to spot the difference. Uphold the Law is last on the list, I think, because it's the most straightforward, and at the same time has the most potential conflicts with the other 2. But you can't really do any of them when the law is privatized, arbitrary, and capricious, captured by corporate interests with armies of lawyers, whose only job is to make sure their clients adhere to the letter of the law, even as they undermine its spirit. None of this is a judgment, you understand. The potential for conflict between all of these directives is also a potential for story. Like this one. Murphy almost kills Clarence when they first meet again, in Clarence thinking that he's appealing to authority by reminding Murphy that he's a cop, is actually appealing to Murphy's human moral center. The part of him that actually does want to uphold the law. By the end, with the police on strike, chaos reigning in the streets, and the Boddicker-Jones alliance revealed, at least to Murphy, it's totally okay for Murphy to just straight up stab Clarence in the neck. Even if he is a new being, made in the image of Alex Murphy, his ability to tell Clarence, "I'm not arresting you anymore," is a clear sign of the ability to make one of the most human things you can make, an independent judgment call. Let's assume he is Murphy, though, and ask ourselves how he survived all that trauma and that programming. We barely meet Murphy as a human. Or rather, a 100% old-fashioned homegrown human. But what we see paints a picture of someone much more well-adjusted than your average late 80s action movie cop protagonist. Or any cop protagonist in the post-Dirty Harry era who isn't played by Eddie Murphy. At least this Murphy has a living wife and a kid who didn't outright hate him. At least as far as we know. His visor could always be adding a bit of a rose tint to those few fragments of memory he manages to recover. I mentioned phantom limb syndrome a while back. Deprived of its usual two-way communication with the nerves that it grew up on, the brain will sometimes remember them. Or imagine them, to use a completely unscientific phrase that, again, I'm talking to lay people here. All you pedants, stand down, please. Or actually, don't. Feel free to rip me a new one in the comments section. I can use the engagement. Point is, this is why RoboCop twirls his gun, even before he remembers why. And because he does this in front of a whole crowd, his partner, Lewis, recognizes him. And that's what really draws Murphy out of his shell. He has a friend, a colleague who recognizes him, even with all the shiny chrome layered on top. A comrade who, immediately after the nightmare of his own death, tells him to his faceplate, "Murphy, it's you," causing him to do the very human thing of slowly backing away from information he'd rather not process at the moment, thank you very much, and setting up a parallel to what she'll say to him later on in the OCP parking garage. "Murphy, it's me, Lewis." Much is made about the healing power of love in American culture. And because we're so damn repressed, when we say love, most of us mean sexual attraction. Much less is made in our culture about the healing power of friendship. About its ability to draw us out of the shells we've built for ourselves or been hammered into by this deliberately dehumanizing world. About how good it is to have someone, anyone, who reacts to our emergence from our shells, not with the horror or disgust that we might expect, but with a simple, "It's good to see you again, Murphy." The power of having someone who recognizes you as a person, even in the midst of all the mechanized horror that modern life traps us in, cannot be overstated. Someone to hang out with in dangerous places, drive cars way too fast, and shoot things. Either the shit or literal objects that represent your emergence from your second childhood. There's much debate these days, at least in the circles I travel in, about whether or not there are any good cops. My contention has always been that even if there are, they're trapped in the same hideous system as everyone else, designed to make not just bad cops, but state-sponsored murder machines. There's another group of thugs in this movie who mercilessly pump round after round into Murphy's body. And it's the SWAT team. Much less talked about than the Bodiger gang, because they don't laugh while they do it, and thus cannot be turned back on the audience in some kind of recursive criticism about desensitization to violence, or some such nonsense. Oh yes, we all laughed when Kenny got turned into red jelly by the Ed 209. That means we're all exactly like these laughing shitheads. The cold efficiency with which the SWAT team follows their orders to destroy RoboCop is no less dangerous than the Bodiger gang's cackling. I'm going to talk more about where SWAT teams came from and why they're such a problem in probably RoboCop 3. But for now, I'd like to note the three cops who actually object to Dick Jones's order: Kaplan, Ramirez, and Chessman. Three characters so obscure, I needed the fandom.com wiki to find out their names, even after all these years of rewatches. And they act as a kind of secondary Greek chorus, the media break talking heads being the primary ones. But Kaplan, Ramirez, and Chessman are much more immediate, because they're on the ground for the action. The last time we see them, they're arguing with SWAT Lieutenant Hedgecock in front of the whole rest of his team that RoboCop is still a cop, for God's sake. So okay, we got Kaplan, Ramirez, and Chessman, plus Lewis and Murphy. That's 5 good cops for the whole of Detroit, 4 of whom are ignored, and 1 of whom is fired upon by a whole-ass SWAT team. Maybe 6, since, as bosses go, Sergeant Reed seems alright. His biggest problem appears to be the fact that he's a boss, and doesn't believe in direct action getting satisfaction. But then again, why would he? Ever since the 1960s, the entire American ruling class has done everything in its considerable power to make sure direct action will never get satisfaction ever again. The old cliché, often misattributed to Gandhi, when it actually came from an American labor lawyer named Nicholas Klein in 1914, used to go, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Nowadays it goes, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they call the SWAT team on you. Then they ignore you and laugh at you again. All the while you're being monitored, tracked, cross-referenced, indexed, mined for metadata, and probably infiltrated. In fact, you'd be stupid to assume that you aren't already being infiltrated, even as we speak. And that breeds a kind of suspicious paranoia that's the exact opposite of solidarity, and reacts to it the same way matter and antimatter react when they get together. A new wrinkle's emerging these days. First, they do all of the above, and then they cancel a few propaganda TV shows, in the hope that you, symbol-obsessed American that you are, will mistake that for meaningful change. Oh wow, whoop-de-doo, you canceled Cops a decade after everyone under 60 stopped watching it. Even ironically. Like, call me when Dick Wolf has to beg for change on the streets of LA. But moving the fight into the realm of symbolism was almost always inevitable. As a country, we're much more equipped for that fight, since it doesn't usually involve tear gas or pepper balls. So when I see people out there calling RoboCop propaganda, I cringe in disappointment, but not surprise. This is a problem Verhoeven's had throughout his American career, and it started right here with this film. Over and over again, his straight-faced, extra-dry satires of contemporary life run up against the blinkered, miseducated, almost magically realist notion, so strong in American criticism that depiction equals endorsement, and endorsement can have a strong influence on the weak mind. By which most people mean, every mind except mine. I'm a smart person who totally and completely understood this film upon my first viewing when I was like 10. But oh, you dum-dums out there in movie land, yes, mindlessly repeating your catchphrases and cackling madly at things that aren't even jokes. Yes, you might take this the wrong way. You have to be protected against taking things the wrong way by people like me, because I'm so fucking trustworthy. Faced with all this, we have no choice but to keep our friends close and hunker down for a long and ugly fight. A fight not only for our own humanity in the face of increasingly mechanized death, but also for some of the vast pools of resources that are currently being hoarded by bunches of suit-wearing dicks. Dick Jones, Clarence Boddicker, Lieutenant Hedgecock. I'm sensing a theme here. But anyway, we've all got to get together and fight for a world where the almighty, quote-unquote, free market no longer determines the destiny of this so-called democracy. A world where I don't have to call this democracy so-called or put so many damn scare quotes around it all the time. A world where RoboCop can no longer pass as a documentary and can just go back to being the really, really damn good American sci-fi superhero movie that everyone mistook it for when it first came out. Though, of course, it is that too. Which is certainly more than you can say for its sequels. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked this video, hit the like button and the subscribe button and the little bell next to the subscribe button that may or may not even be there anymore. I don't fucking know or care. And if you really like this video, then consider supporting the show on Patreon. Much like the fine people whose names I'm about to read right now. Mr. Hootie Dean, Detective Steve, The After Movie Diner, and Stu G.